The Aegis Club was not merely a restaurant, it was a cathedral consecrated to the gods of capital and influence. The air itself seemed different within its walls, heavier and scented with the subtle perfume of old money, expensive leather, and the earthy aroma of truffles shaved over perfectly seared scallops. Light did not simply illuminate the space. It cascaded from immense crystal chandeliers, fracturing into a million prismatic shards that danced across the dark, book-matched mahogany panels lining the room. The floors were a vast expanse of polished Italian marble, their black and white tiles reflecting the hushed, almost reverent movements of the patrons and staff. Every sound was deliberately muted, absorbed by the thick crimson carpets and the weighty velvet drapes that shielded this inner sanctum from the clamor of the outside world. The gentle clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain was the room's primary symphony, a delicate percussion accompanying the low, confidential murmurs of men and women who shaped markets and toppled governments between their appetizer and main course. This was a world built on exclusion. A gilded cage where power was the only currency that truly mattered, and every detail, from the weight of the water glasses to the crispness of the linen napkins, was engineered to reinforce a sense of absolute, untouchable superiority. Within this theater of opulence, Ilara Vance moved with a practiced grace that rendered her nearly invisible. Her uniform, a simple but impeccably tailored black dress, was a costume of subservience, designed to blend into the shadows of the grand dining room. Her movements were a study in efficiency, a silent ballet she had perfected over 3 long years of navigating this rarefied environment. She could refill a water glass without a single ripple disturbing its surface, clear a table with the swiftness of a phantom, and anticipate a patron's needs before they were consciously aware of them. To the titans of industry she served, she was a function, not a person. A pair of hands that delivered their $500 bottle of Chateau Margaux or their plate of Wagyu beef. But beneath this veneer of quiet competence, a mind of extraordinary brilliance was constantly at work, observing, analyzing, and remembering. Her gaze, though professionally downcast, missed nothing. She catalogued the subtle shifts in power dynamics at each table, the nervous tics of a junior partner trying to impress a senior executive, the predatory smiles that preceded a corporate raid. She was a ghost in the machine of wealth, a silent witness to the machinations of the very world that had shattered her own. The weight of her purpose was a constant physical presence within her, a cold, heavy stone settled deep in her gut. Every perfectly plated dish she carried, every obsequious smile she offered, was a transaction. The exorbitant tips she earned were not for her. They were a lifeline, immediately converted into the funds that paid for the quiet, sterile room where her father spent his days. The image of him was seared onto the inside of her eyelids, a permanent fixture in her mind's eye. She saw him not as the vibrant, brilliant engineer he once was, the man whose laughter could fill a house, but as the shell he had become. She pictured him sitting in his specialized chair, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window, his once expressive hands now limp in his lap. The rhythmic, gentle hum of the medical equipment that monitored his fragile state was the soundtrack to her life, a constant reminder of the debt she was paying. The opulence surrounding her at the Aegis Club was a bitter irony, a cruel mirror reflecting the life of comfort and security that had been stolen from them, a life she now had to serve piece by piece to the very kind of men who had orchestrated their ruin. Her memory was a vast, orderly library, a place of refuge and of pain. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between serving courses, she would allow herself to wander its halls, back to a time when her life was a straight, ascending line. She could feel the worn leather of the chairs in the Yale Law School library, smell the comforting scent of aging paper and ink, and hear the voice of her contracts professor singling her out for praise. She had been the prodigy, the one destined for greatness. Her mind a finely tuned instrument capable of dissecting the most complex corporate legal documents with surgical precision. She possessed a photographic memory for the intricate clauses, the hidden loopholes, the subtle yet crucial placement of a comma that could mean the difference between a billion-dollar fortune and financial ruin. Then came the phone call, a crackle of static and a panicked voice on the other end that had cleaved her life in two. The news of her father's stroke, triggered by the catastrophic loss of his company Vance Innovations, had been the single blow that demolished the entire architecture of her future. She had walked away from Yale without a backward glance, the world of torts and mergers replaced by a new reality of medical charts and mounting bills. Her once celebrated legal mind was now a secret weapon, hidden beneath a waitress's apron, waiting for a war she never wanted to fight. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The atmosphere in the Aegis Club, already rarefied, underwent a subtle but palpable shift when Marcus Thorne entered. It was as if the room's gravitational center had suddenly changed. Conversations did not stop, but their volume lowered, and eyes flickered discreetly towards the entrance. Thorne did not simply walk. He commanded the space, his presence a wave of cold, unassailable authority that washed over the room. He was dressed in a bespoke suit of charcoal gray, so dark it was almost black, tailored to fit his powerful frame with a precision that bespoke a cost of tens of thousands of dollars. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face, though handsome in a severe, chiseled way, was a mask of perpetual disdain. His eyes, the color of pale ice, swept across the dining room not with interest, but with the casual appraisal of a king surveying his domain. He did not see people. He saw assets, liabilities, and obstacles. With him was a younger man, a sycophant whose eager, nervous energy contrasted sharply with Thorne's glacial calm. Thorne moved towards his regular table, the best in the house, acknowledging the deferential nod of the maitre d', with a flick of his fingers that was less a gesture of recognition and more one of dismissal. As fate, or perhaps a crueler design, would have it, Elara was assigned to his table. A jolt, cold and sharp, went through her as the maitre d' gave her the instruction. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the cold dread that always accompanied the sight of him. She had served him before, many times, and on each occasion she had to consciously school her features into a mask of placid neutrality, forcing her hands to remain steady as she poured his wine. To him she was utterly insignificant, part of the scenery, but to her he was a walking, breathing monument to her family's destruction. He was the architect of her father's living death. She approached the table, her steps measured, her posture perfect. She recited the evening specials in a low, professional tone, her voice a carefully controlled instrument that betrayed none of the silent fury churning within her. Thorne did not look at her. He waved a hand impatiently, cutting her off mid-sentence, and ordered a vintage of Bordeaux that cost more than her monthly rent. He spoke not to her but past her, his focus entirely on the young mentee he was grooming in his own ruthless image, beginning a lecture on the nature of absolute power. The main courses had been served, and Thorne, warmed by the expensive wine and the rapt attention of his disciple, decided it was time for a practical demonstration. To illustrate a point about the importance of what he called foundational ruthlessness, he signaled to the maitre d' again. A moment later, a framed document was brought to the table and placed on a small easel beside him. Elara, standing a respectful distance away, felt her breath catch in her throat. The blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. It was a contract, its paper yellowed with age, encased in a heavy, ornate gold frame. Even from several feet away, she recognized it. It was the document that had haunted her nightmares for a decade, the legal instrument that had functioned as a guillotine, severing her father from his life's work. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy, painful drumbeat against her ribs. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the soft music, the low hum of conversation, faded into a distant roar, her entire universe narrowing to that single framed object on the table. Thorn gestured grandly towards the contract, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He leaned towards his mentee, his voice loud enough for Elara and the surrounding tables to hear. "This is my masterpiece," he declared, tapping a manicured finger against the glass. "The acquisition of Vance Innovations. It was the cornerstone upon which my entire empire was built." He then turned his cold, dismissive gaze directly upon Elara for the first time that evening. He looked at her uniform, at the tray she held, and a cruel light danced in his eyes. "See this?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, as if speaking to a child. "This is what power looks like. This is the result of seeing an opportunity and having the will to seize it, no matter the cost. It's a concept that someone like you," he paused for effect, letting the insult land, "could never possibly understand." To drive his point home, he gestured towards the bottom of the document. He even pointed out the signature, a frantic scrawl of ink. He mocked the fool who signed his life away for nothing. The name on that line was her father's. The world stopped. For Elara, time itself seemed to fracture and slow to a crawl. Thorn's words echoed in the sudden vast silence of her mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile walls of her composure. The insult was not just directed at her, the waitress. It was a desecration of her father's memory, a final, arrogant dance on the grave of his legacy. An image flashed through her mind with blinding clarity. Her father in his workshop years ago, his face alight with passion as he explained his latest invention, his hands, strong and capable, sketching out complex schematics. That vibrant image was violently replaced by the present. The slackness of his face, the vacant look in his eyes, the fury that had been simmering within her for years, a low, controlled burn, suddenly solidified. It was not a hot, reckless rage, but something colder, denser, and infinitely more dangerous. It was a crystalline certainty, a perfect, unshakable resolve. The trembling in her hands ceased. Her breathing became slow and even. The waitress, the invisible servant, receded, and in her place, the brilliant legal mind from Yale, the grieving daughter, the avenger, rose to the surface. The war had just been declared, and she was ready. A profound stillness descended upon Elara, a silence so complete it felt as if she were at the bottom of a deep ocean. The cacophony of the restaurant, the murmur of distant conversations, the faint melody from the grand piano in the lobby, it all dissolved into a single, low hum. Thorn's final, mocking words aimed at her but desecrating her father did not just echo in her ears, they seemed to imprint themselves directly onto her soul, a brand of searing ice. The image of her father, not the broken man in the sterile care facility, but the vibrant inventor whose eyes shone with the fire of creation, flooded her consciousness. She saw his hands, stained with grease and graphite, lovingly assembling a prototype, his voice, full of warmth and confidence, explaining the complex mechanics to a younger, adoring version of herself. That memory, so precious and so painful, collided with the present reality of Thorn's casual cruelty, and in that collision, something within her fused, hardened, and became unbreakable. The years of suppressed grief, of quiet, grinding servitude, of righteous anger held in check by filial duty, all coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard clarity. The waitress was gone, burned away in the crucible of that single public insult, and what remained was the scholar, the warrior, the daughter whose love was now being forged into a weapon. The change was not explosive, it was terrifyingly subtle. A spectator would have seen only a slight shift in her posture, a straightening of her spine that added an imperceptible inch to her height. But within her, a tectonic shift had occurred. The frantic, panicked beating of her heart, which had hammered against her ribs just moments before, slowed to a steady, powerful, and deliberate rhythm, like a war drum sounding a charge. The cold dread in her stomach did not vanish. It transformed, solidifying from a liquid fear into a core of glacial resolve. Her hands, which had threatened to tremble, became as still and steady as carved marble. She took a single, slow, silent breath, and as she exhaled, she let go of the fear, the invisibility, the carefully constructed persona of the deferential servant. She was no longer hiding. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. She felt the full weight of her intellect, the vast and ordered library of legal knowledge she had kept locked away, come rushing to the forefront of her mind, its doors thrown wide open. Every statute, every precedent, every loophole she had ever studied was now at her command, an arsenal ready to be deployed. With a grace that was no longer self-effacing but imbued with a newfound, chilling authority, she reached for the half-empty bottle of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. Her fingers wrapped around its cool, dark glass with a sureness that was absolute. She lifted it from the silver coaster, its significant weight feeling like a scepter in her hand. For a fraction of a second, Thorne and his young companion watched her, expecting her to refill their glasses, their expressions a mixture of impatience and entitlement. But she did not pour. Instead, she moved with a fluid, deliberate motion and placed the bottle squarely in the center of the table, next to the framed contract. She did not set it down gently. She placed it with a soft but definitive thud, a sound that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the room, a punctuation mark at the end of her long, silent suffering. The sound drew the eyes of the adjacent tables, a small, audible declaration that the established order of this universe had just been fundamentally altered. She then folded her hands neatly in front of her, her gaze lifting from the floor to meet Marcus Thorne's icy stare directly, without a trace of deference or fear. The first words that left her lips were not loud, not shrill with anger, but were spoken in a voice that was eerily calm, clear, and resonant. It was a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty, a voice that belonged not in a restaurant serving the powerful, but in a courtroom cross-examining them. That signature is a forgery. The statement hung in the air, as stark and shocking as a crack appearing in one of the grand crystal chandeliers above. A wave of silence radiated out from their table, a ripple effect of disbelief that stilled conversations and turned heads. Thorne's smug, condescending smile froze on his lips, the expression of a predator who has just realized the prey it was toying with is not prey at all. His eyes, which had held only dismissal for her, now flickered with confusion, a momentary inability to process the impossible words that had just been spoken by the woman in the black uniform, the woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a ghost. Illyra did not give him time to recover or to formulate a response. She pressed her attack, her words now a cascade of precise, irrefutable facts that struck him like a surgeon's scalpel. "The kerning on the capital V in Vance is inconsistent with my father's hand," she continued, her eyes locked on his, her voice unwavering. "He always connected it to the succeeding vowel with a low, sweeping ligature, a habit from his engineering schematics. This signature uses a high, sharp connection, a classic characteristic of a traceover forgery attempting to replicate form without understanding the inherent kinetic rhythm of the original signatory." The technical jargon, spoken with such effortless authority, was a language Thorne understood. The language of meticulous, damning detail. The blood began to drain from his face, the ruddy complexion of a man well fed on wine and power giving way to a sickly, pale white. His mentee stared, his mouth slightly agape, looking back and forth between the waitress and his titan of a boss, the foundation of his worldview crumbling before his very eyes. "And that is not the only flaw in your masterpiece," Illyra went on, her voice dropping slightly, becoming even more focused, more lethal. "You backdated the patent transfer clause, Section 4B, to March 2nd. However, the intellectual property framework it references, specifically the digital watermarking patent, was not filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office until April 15th of that same year. This was a deliberate act to circumvent the SEC's mandatory 90-day review period for technology acquisitions of that class, a violation of federal securities law." A bead of sweat trickled down Thorne's temple. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at an executioner. In that moment, she had stripped away his power, his wealth, his carefully crafted persona, and exposed the hollow, fraudulent core beneath. She had done it not with a weapon, but with memory, with knowledge, with the truth he had tried to bury for a decade under a mountain of money and influence. She let the weight of her analysis settle into the now deafening silence of the room. Every patron within earshot was frozen, their forks suspended mid-air, their hushed conversations dead. They were witnessing something far more compelling than any business deal discussed that evening. The spectacular, impossible implosion of a king in his own court. Ilara took one final steadying breath, gathering all the pain, all the love for her father, all the years of injustice into a single, devastating sentence. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice now a low, intense whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "You did not acquire Vance Innovations. You stole it. You stole it from my father, Arthur Vance." The name, spoken aloud in this place for the first time in 10 years, was a verdict and a vindication. It was the final, perfectly placed stone that brought the entire edifice of Thorne's arrogance crashing down around him. The shock on Marcus Thorne's face finally, violently, gave way to rage. It was a primal, cornered animal fury, the desperate lashing out of a man whose invincibility had just been shattered by the most insignificant person in his orbit. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck, suffusing his face with a blotchy, mottled crimson. His fists clenched on the table, rattling the fine silverware. The mask of sophisticated control was gone, replaced by the raw, undisguised face of a common bully. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he roared, his voice, no longer a confident baritone, but a strained, cracking bellow that echoed through the cavernous dining room. The sudden explosion of sound made several patrons flinch. He was not refuting her claims. He couldn't. Instead, he attacked the only thing he could: her position, her status, her perceived powerlessness. He was trying to shrink her back into the role of the invisible servant, to negate her words by negating her very existence. He violently shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the polished marble floor, a sound as ugly as his fury. He stabbed a trembling finger in her direction, his whole body shaking with a mixture of indignation and a newfound terrifying fear. "Manager!" he bellowed, his eyes scanning the room with wild desperation. "Get over here now!" The maître d', a man named Jean-Pierre, who normally glided through the room with the unshakable poise of a diplomat, scurried towards the table, his face a mask of panic and abject terror. The Aegis Club ran on a simple principle: keep the Titans happy at all costs. Marcus Thorne was not just a patron. He was a foundational pillar of their clientele, a man whose displeasure could cost them millions in lost business and prestige. Jean-Pierre arrived at the table, bowing slightly, his eyes darting nervously between Thorne's apoplectic face and Ilara's unnervingly calm demeanor. "I want her out of my sight," Thorne snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl. "I want her fired. Immediately. Do you understand me?" He spat the words at Jean-Pierre, who flinched as if he had been physically struck. The manager's professional composure crumbled completely. He turned to Ilara, his expression a pathetic mix of apology and desperation. He did not ask for her side of the story. He did not question the billionaire's demand. In this world, the customer was not just right, the customer was God, and this particular God was demanding a sacrifice. "Mademoiselle Vance," he stammered, avoiding her eyes, wringing his hands. "Please, you must. I am so sorry, but you must leave. Your employment here is terminated." The words, though expected, still landed with a dull, heavy thud in Ilara's chest. It was the price of speaking the truth, the predictable consequence of challenging a tyrant on his own ground. Ilara did not protest. She did not argue or plead. To do so would have been to diminish the power of her stand. She simply gave a single, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of the transaction that had just taken place. She had traded her job for a moment of pure, unadulterated justice, and in her heart, she knew it was the best bargain she had ever made. As she turned to leave, she allowed her gaze to meet Thorne's one last time. He expected to see fear, or tears, or regret. He saw none of those things. Instead, he saw an expression of such cold, calculated resolve that it sent a genuine chill down his spine. Her eyes did not hold the look of a defeated employee. They held the promise of a dedicated enemy. It was a silent declaration that this was not an ending, but the formal beginning of a war he never knew he was fighting, a war he was now terrifyingly unprepared for. The walk out of the Aegis Club was the longest of her life. It felt as if she were moving through thick, heavy water, the silence of the room pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes on her back, a mixture of shock, pity, and perhaps a flicker of admiration. She kept her head held high, her back straight, her steps even, and measured as she followed the humiliated Jean-Pierre towards the grand entrance. She passed tables laden with extravagant food that would now go to waste, past patrons in $1,000 suits who had just witnessed a more dramatic spectacle than any opera. The heavy ornate doors that had once represented a barrier between her world and theirs were pulled open, and she stepped out of the climate-controlled opulence and into the raw, biting air of the New York City night. The sounds of the city, the blare of a distant siren, the rumble of a passing subway, the cacophony of traffic, rushed in to greet her, a stark and welcome return to reality. As the doors swung shut behind her, sealing her out of that gilded cage forever, the adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, and for a moment, the full, crushing weight of her reality threatened to overwhelm her. She stood on the cold pavement, the simple black dress of her uniform offering little protection against the wind that whipped down the canyon of skyscrapers. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She had no job. She had no income. The mountain of her father's medical bills loomed before her, larger and more insurmountable than ever. A raw, primal panic clawed at the edges of her composure. Had she made a catastrophic mistake? Had her single act of defiance just condemned her father to a lesser quality of care? Or worse, the fear was a physical thing, a cold, constricting band around her chest that made it difficult to breathe. For a single, terrifying moment, she felt utterly and completely alone, a tiny, powerless figure standing against an empire. But then another image rose in her mind, eclipsing the fear. It was the look on Marcus Thorne's face, the shock, the panic. The raw, undiluted terror of a man who believed he was untouchable, suddenly realizing he was not. He was vulnerable. He was guilty. And she, Alara Vance, was the only person in the world who knew exactly where to strike. The despair that had threatened to drown her receded, replaced by a current of pure, unyielding purpose. The firing was not a punishment, it was a liberation. She was no longer bound by the need to be invisible, to serve her enemy with a smile. She was free to fight. The cold night air no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a baptism, washing away the last vestiges of the submissive waitress, and leaving only the determined strategist in her place. A slow, determined smile touched her lips for the first time that night. Thorne thought he had won by having her fired. He had no idea he had just handed her the very weapon she needed: freedom. The long subway ride back to her small apartment in Queens was a journey through a different world. The gleaming marble and hushed tones of the Aegis Club were replaced by the screech of steel wheels, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the weary faces of ordinary people heading home after a long day's work. It was her world, the real world, and it grounded her. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color as the train rattled through the darkness. Her mind, now fully unshackled, was a whirlwind of activity. She was no longer just remembering the past, she was planning the future. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, not for the emotional satisfaction, but for the tactical data it provided. Thorne's reaction, his immediate resort to blustering rage rather than denial, was a confession. He was afraid because he knew she was right. And more importantly, the fact that he had the contract framed meant the original, fraudulent document still existed. It wasn't just a memory, it was a physical piece of evidence. When she finally arrived at her building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her small, sparsely furnished apartment, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The space was humble, filled with second-hand furniture and stacks of books, but it was her sanctuary, her command center. On a small table by the window sat a single, framed photograph. It was of her and her father, taken years ago, on the day his company had secured its first major patent. They were both smiling, their faces bright with hope and pride. She picked up the photograph, her thumb gently tracing the outline of her father's younger, happier face. "This is for you," she whispered to the image. "It all is." It was a vow, a promise made in the quiet solitude of her apartment, a promise that she would see this through to the very end, no matter the cost. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about restoration, about reclaiming a legacy that had been stolen. She knew she couldn't wage this war alone. Thorne was a Goliath, with an army of lawyers, fixers, and public relations specialists at his beck and call. She was a David with a single sharp stone of truth. She needed a sling. She needed allies. Her mind immediately turned to one person, a figure from her past who represented integrity, intellect, and justice. Professor Alistair Finch. He had been her mentor at Yale, the man who had first recognized the true scope of her talent for corporate law. He was a lion of legal ethics, a man who had turned down lucrative offers from massive corporate firms to dedicate his life to teaching and, more recently, to running a small pro bono corporate justice initiative. He was a man who despised bullies like Marcus Thorne with every fiber of his being. If anyone would believe her, if anyone could help her, it was him. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched through an old box of law school notebooks, finally finding a worn business card with his private number on it. It had been years since they had last spoken. What if he didn't remember her? What if he dismissed her story as the fantastical ranting of a disgruntled waitress? The self-doubt was a familiar enemy, a ghost from the life of invisibility she had just left behind. She took a deep breath, forcing it down. The Alara who backed down was gone. She dialed the number before she could lose her nerve, her heart pounding in her ears as the phone began to ring on the other end. After 3 rings, a familiar, gravelly voice answered, filled with the weary impatience of a man who worked too late and cared too much. "Finch, Professor Finch. It's Alara Vance. I was in your advanced contracts seminar a decade ago." Her own voice sounded foreign to her, hesitant and small. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of silence in which her entire future seemed to hang in the balance. Then the professor's voice returned, softer now, with a spark of recognition. "Alara Vance. Of course. The prodigy. I often wondered what became of you. You just vanished." This small acknowledgement, this memory of who she used to be, was all the encouragement she needed. The dam of her composure broke, and the story came tumbling out, not as an emotional rant, but as a precise, ordered, and damning legal argument. She recounted the events at the restaurant, the details of the fraudulent contract, the backdated clause, the forged signature, Thorne's explosive reaction. She was no longer a former student asking for a favor. She was a legal mind presenting a case. As she spoke, she could almost feel the atmosphere on the other end of the line shifting. Professor Finch's initial weariness was replaced by a sharp, focused attention. He interrupted her only to ask clarifying questions, his mind clearly working, connecting the dots, seeing the legal framework of the crime she was outlining. He knew of Marcus Thorne, of course. Thorne was a legendary monster in the world of corporate law, a man whose reputation for ruthless, borderline illegal acquisitions was whispered about in hushed tones but never proven. Alara's story was not just a story, it was a key, a potential Rosetta Stone to unlock the secrets of Thorne's entire empire. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line, a silence pregnant with possibility. He didn't express pity or sympathy. He expressed something far more valuable. "I believe you, Alara," he said, his voice low and serious. "I believe every word." The relief that washed over Alara was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. To be seen, to be heard, to be believed. It was a validation she hadn't realized she was so desperate for. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of her counteroffensive. Professor Finch was not a man for idle talk. "Can you be in my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.? he asked, his voice all business now. "We have a great deal of work to do. There is a journalist I have been working with, a man named Julian Croft. He has been building a case against Thorne for years, but he has always been missing a smoking gun, an insider witness. I believe, Ms. Vance, that you are about to become his most valuable source." It was happening. The gears were turning. The solitary quest for justice had just become a conspiracy. The next morning, Alara walked into Professor Finch's office at the university. It was a world away from the Aegis Club. Instead of mahogany and crystal, the room was a chaotic temple of knowledge, with books stacked floor to ceiling, overflowing from shelves and covering nearly every flat surface. The air smelled of old paper, coffee, and righteous indignation. Professor Finch, a man with a wild mane of gray hair and eyes that burned with a fierce intelligence, greeted her not with a handshake, but by clearing a space for her to sit amidst a mountain of legal briefs. He listened intently as she once again recounted her story, this time with even greater detail. He pushed her, challenged her, forcing her to recall every comma, every date, every specific turn of phrase from the contract she had only seen for a few minutes. To his astonishment, she could. She closed her eyes and saw the document in her mind's eye, as clear as if it were still on the easel in front of her. She recited entire clauses verbatim, pinpointing the subtle yet illegal language used to strip her father's patents of their value before the acquisition was even finalized. She sketched the forged signature from memory, highlighting the inconsistencies with a pen on a legal pad. Finch watched, his initial belief in her story transforming into a profound sense of awe. He was not just looking at a victim seeking justice, he was witnessing the reawakening of one of the most brilliant legal minds he had ever had the privilege to teach. Her years in the wilderness had not dulled her skills. They had sharpened them, honed them on the whetstone of grief and determination. When she was finished, Finch leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "He is a dead man walking," he said, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "He just doesn't know it yet." He picked up his phone and made a call. "Julian, it's Alistair. I have someone you need to meet. It's about Thorne." "No. This is different. This is the break we have been waiting for. This is the beginning of the end for him." Alara listened, her heart swelling with a feeling she had not allowed herself to feel in a decade: hope. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was real. She was no longer just a daughter fighting for her father's memory. She was now the tip of the spear in a much larger hunt, and for the first time she knew with absolute certainty that she was not the one who was cornered. The real prey was Marcus Thorne, sitting in his penthouse office, blissfully unaware that the ghost of his oldest crime had just returned to drag him into the light. The stage was set, the players were assembling, and the hunt for irrefutable proof was about to begin. The meeting took place not in a sterile corporate boardroom, but in the cluttered, ink-stained heart of Julian Croft's world. The archives of an independent newspaper, a basement space that smelled of decaying paper, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of the printing press. Julian was a man who seemed to be woven from the same material as his surroundings. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was a chaotic mess, and his eyes, behind a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, held the weary yet fiercely intelligent gaze of a hunter who had been tracking the same beast for a very long time. He listened to Alara's story without interruption, his posture leaning forward, his hands steepled under his chin, his focus so intense it felt like a physical force in the room. Professor Finch stood by a towering shelf of bound newspapers, a silent, leonine presence, his role as mentor and connector now fulfilled, leaving the field to the two warriors who would lead the charge. When Ilara finished, Julian did not offer words of sympathy. He offered a far greater gift. He slid a massive corkboard, covered in a spiderweb of photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings, all connected by strings of red yarn, into the pool of light cast by a single desk lamp. At the very center of this web, like a malevolent spider, was a photograph of Marcus Thorne, smiling his predatory smile at a charity gala. Julian tapped a finger on the picture. I have been chasing this man for 15 years. I have stories from dozens of former employees, from competitors he bankrupted, from families he ruined. But every single one of them is bound by an ironclad non-disclosure agreement with a penalty clause so severe it would mean total financial annihilation. Thorne doesn't just buy companies, he buys silence. What you have, he looked at Ilara, his weary eyes alight with a new, dangerous fire, is different. You were a witness. You saw the primary document, and your memory of its flaws is a key. But a memory, even a perfect one, is not enough to convince a jury or the SEC. We need corroboration. We need a second voice, or better yet, a piece of that original sin that he can't bury. He explained the immense legal fortress Thorne had built around himself, a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and the most expensive, ruthless lawyers money could buy. Attacking him head-on with just her testimony would be suicide. She would be dismissed as a disgruntled employee, her reputation shredded, her life ruined, and Thorne would walk away without a scratch, more untouchable than ever. The scope of the challenge was immense, a towering mountain of power and influence. Ilara felt a familiar chill of despair begin to creep into the edges of her resolve. The brief, intoxicating taste of hope she had felt in Finch's office was now being tempered by the harsh, cold reality of the battlefield. She looked at the board, at the dozens of dead ends and silenced victims represented by the clippings and notes. She was just one more person with a story, one more victim whose life had been casually destroyed by the man in the photograph. But then her gaze fell upon a small, tucked-away section of the board labeled Thorne Capital Internal Structure, 2010 to 2015. It was a list of names of executives and analysts who had worked at the firm during the time of her father's acquisition. Her mind, that vast and orderly library, began to work. She wasn't just a victim. She was a corporate law scholar. She knew the pressure points, the standard operating procedures of a hostile takeover, the types of people involved in the due diligence, the ones who would have had to handle the paperwork, who would have seen the fine print. She scanned the names, her memory cross-referencing them with old articles from the Wall Street Journal, with press releases she had idly read years ago. Her mind was a search engine, sifting through a decade of stored, seemingly useless data, looking for a connection, a vulnerability. Most of the names on the list were dead ends, men and women who had risen through the ranks with Thorne, their fortunes inextricably linked to his. They would never talk. But then her eyes landed on one name, David Chen, former senior analyst in mergers and acquisitions. She remembered reading about him. He had left Thorne Capital abruptly about a year after the Vance Innovations deal. The official story was that he had left to pursue other opportunities, but the departure was too sudden for a rising star. There were whispers, quickly silenced, of a disagreement with Thorne over a subsequent deal. To a casual observer, it was nothing. To Ilara, it was a scent, a faint trail in the cold wilderness of their investigation. She pointed to the name. This one, she said, her voice quiet but firm. David Chen. He was the lead analyst on my father's acquisition. He would have been responsible for the financial modeling and the patent valuation. He would have seen the contract up close, multiple times. He left the company under a cloud. He's our best chance at finding an insider. Julian and Finch looked at the name, then back at her, a new level of respect dawning in their eyes. She wasn't just providing the motive. She was already formulating the strategy. Finding David Chen was the next impossible task. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the high-flying world of finance. There was no social media presence, no public profile, no record of him working for another major firm. Julian, with his journalistic resources, put out feelers through his network of sources, calling in favors from old contacts who owed him. The first few days were a frustrating exercise in futility, a series of closed doors and curt rejections. It seemed Chen had deliberately and methodically erased his professional footprint, the act of a man running from something, a man desperate not to be found. Alara felt the pressure of time with every passing hour. Each day that went by was another day her father sat in that silent room, another day that Thorne sat in his penthouse office, believing he was invincible. The investigation felt like trying to punch through a wall of smoke. Thorne's influence was so pervasive it seemed to anticipate their every move, silencing people before they could even be approached. The frustration was a physical weight, a tightness in her chest that made it hard to sleep, her mind constantly replaying the scene in the restaurant, a reminder of what was at stake. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior researcher in Julian's newsroom, tasked with the mind-numbing job of combing through public property records, found a match. David Chen hadn't disappeared, he had retreated. He had used his severance to buy a small, struggling bookstore in a quiet, forgotten neighborhood in Brooklyn. He had traded the world of billion-dollar deals for the quiet, dusty world of used paperbacks. It was the perfect hiding place, a deliberate rejection of everything Thorne Capital represented. Alara knew she had to be the one to approach him. Sending Julian would be too aggressive, too much like a reporter chasing a story. This required a different touch. It required a shared experience, the quiet understanding of one victim speaking to another. She found the bookstore on a gray, drizzly afternoon. It was a small, unassuming place, its windows filled with faded book covers, the bell above the door giving a soft, melancholic jingle as she entered. The air inside smelled of aging paper, leather, and brewing tea. Behind the counter, a man who looked older than his years, with deep-set, weary eyes and a face etched with a quiet, permanent anxiety, looked up from the book he was reading. It was David Chen. Alara didn't introduce herself immediately. She browsed the shelves, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was about to ask this man to risk everything, to confront a past he had worked so hard to bury. She finally approached the counter with a copy of an old, obscure book on engineering ethics. Chen looked at the book, then at her, and a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps recognition, crossed his face. "This was my father's favorite," she said, her voice low and steady. "His name was Arthur Vance." She watched as every ounce of color drained from David Chen's face. The name was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had kept bolted shut for nearly a decade. His hands began to tremble, and he looked around the empty bookstore as if expecting Thorne's enforcers to burst through the door at any moment. "I can't talk about that," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "You have no idea what you're asking. You need to leave. Now." He was terrified, his reaction even more visceral than she had anticipated. This was not just a man with a bad memory, this was a man living in fear of a ghost. But Alara did not leave. She held her ground, her gaze unflinching but filled with a deep, genuine empathy. "I'm not a reporter," she said softly. "I'm his daughter. I was there, at the Aegis Club, a few nights ago. I served Marcus Thorne his dinner. And he showed me the contract, he bragged about it, he called it his masterpiece." The details of her story, the impossible specificity of the location and the event, seemed to break through his wall of fear. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a threat, but a fellow survivor. He saw the same haunted look in her eyes that he saw in his own reflection every morning. The fight went out of him, replaced by a wave of profound, soul-deep weariness. He sank onto a stool behind the counter, burying his face in his hands. It was a confession without words, a gesture of complete and utter defeat. He knew, he whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. He knew the whole thing was a fraud from the start. Over the next hour, in the quiet, dusty sanctuary of his bookstore, David Chen's story came pouring out. He had been a young, ambitious analyst, eager to make his mark. He had been the one to discover the true, revolutionary potential of Arthur Vance's patents, realizing they were worth 10 times what Vance Innovations was valued at. He had presented his findings to Thorne, expecting praise. Instead, Thorne had seen an opportunity for a different kind of victory. He had taken Chen's analysis and used it as a blueprint for the theft. Chen was tasked with drafting the fraudulent documents, backdating the clauses, and creating a financial model that deliberately undervalued the company. He was promised a partnership, a future beyond his wildest dreams. He had gone along with it, quieting the screaming voice of his conscience with the promise of wealth and power. But after the deal was done, after he saw the news reports of Arthur Vance's stroke, the guilt had begun to eat him alive. It wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet anymore. It was a human life, a family, that he had helped destroy. The final straw had come a year later, when Thorne had ordered him to do the same thing to another small family-owned company. Chen had refused. He had confronted Thorne, threatening to go public. Thorne had simply laughed in his face. He reminded Chen of his complicity, of the documents he had signed, the emails he had sent. He was just as guilty as Thorne was. Thorne then presented him with a choice. He could sign the most restrictive non-disclosure agreement in corporate history and walk away with his severance. Or he could be buried in lawsuits, criminally charged as a co-conspirator, and left with nothing. Thorne would use his army of lawyers to paint Chen as the sole architect of the fraud, a rogue employee, while he himself would emerge unscathed. Terrified and broken, Chen had signed the NDA and vanished, choosing a life of quiet, anonymous penance over a fight he knew he could never win. He had lived with the guilt, the shame, and the fear every single day since. Ilara listened to his confession, her own anger mingling with a profound sense of pity for the broken man in front of her. He was a victim too, in his own way, another soul crushed beneath the wheels of Thorne's ambition. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the small bookstore. The only sound was the gentle patter of the rain against the window pane. "I don't have any of the documents," Chen said, his voice hollow. Thorne's people conducted a digital purge. They wiped every server, every hard drive. There is no paper trail. It was a devastating blow. They had their insider, their corroborating witness, but without hard evidence, it was still his word against the billion-dollar reputation of Marcus Thorne. For a moment it seemed they had hit another dead end, a wall they could not possibly scale. Ilara felt her hope begin to fray once more, the victory she had imagined slipping through her fingers like fine sand. The path to justice seemed to be a maze of impenetrable walls, each one higher than the last. But then, a flicker of memory sparked in Chen's exhausted eyes. "A purge, yes," he said, sitting up a little straighter. "But Thorne is a narcissist. And he is paranoid. He never truly deletes anything. He always keeps a copy, a private record of his conquests." He called it the archive. He had a third-party IT contractor, a specialist in data security, build him an off-the-books server, a digital ghost. It wasn't connected to the main corporate network. It was his private, encrypted vault where he kept everything. The original drafts, the incriminating emails, the real numbers. It was his insurance policy and his trophy room. No one at the company knew how to access it except Thorne himself. But I remember the name of the contractor who set it up, a man named Silas Croft. "No relation," he added, looking at Julian's name on the business card Ilara had placed on the counter. "He retired a few years ago, moved somewhere quiet upstate. If anyone knows a way into that server, it's him." It was the slimmest of chances, a single, frayed thread in the darkness, but it was more than they had a moment ago. It was a new direction, a new hunt. The search for Silas Croft was a race against time. Ilara, Julian, and Finch knew that Thorne, despite his arrogance, was not a fool. The confrontation at the restaurant would have shaken him. He would be reviewing his security. burying his secrets even deeper. They had to get to the ghost server before he could wipe it clean for good. Julian's journalistic skills once again proved invaluable. He worked his sources, pulling public records, and within 48 hours he had an address. A small cabin on a lake in the Adirondacks. It was a 6-hour drive from the city, a journey from the concrete canyons of power to the quiet, imposing wilderness of the mountains. They drove through the night, the car a small bubble of light and nervous energy moving through the vast darkness. Lara stared out the window at the passing trees, her mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. Everything hinged on this retired IT specialist, a man who had no reason to help them, a man who had likely been paid a fortune by Thorne for his silence and his expertise. They found Silas Croft at dawn, sitting on the porch of his lakeside cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He was an older man, with a face like a road map of past worries and a sharp, appraising gaze that missed nothing. He was not surprised to see them. "I figured someone would come looking for me eventually," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "When you build a secret vault for a man like Marcus Thorne, you know it's not to store his poetry." He listened patiently as Alara told her story, his expression unreadable. He had built Thorne's archive, a masterpiece of digital security, a fortress he had believed to be impenetrable. He had taken Thorne's money and had asked no questions, content to live out his retirement in peace. But Ilara's story, the quiet dignity with which she spoke of her father, the cold, righteous anger in her eyes, seemed to stir something in him, a conscience he thought he had long since put to sleep. He had spent his life creating locks. For the first time, he felt a moral obligation to provide a key. He explained that the server was protected by a multi-layered encryption that was, for all intents and purposes, unbreakable. There was no password that could be guessed, no code that could be cracked through brute force. Any direct attempt to breach it would trigger an automatic wipe, erasing everything permanently. It seemed, once again, that they had reached an insurmountable obstacle. The treasure vault was in sight, but the door was sealed forever. Ilara's heart sank. To have come so close, to be standing on the very precipice of the truth, only to be denied by a wall of code, felt like the cruelest joke of all. The exhaustion of the past few days washed over her, a heavy, leaden cloak of defeat. She had put all her faith in this one, final path, and it had led her to another dead end. The weight of her father's silent suffering, the image of Thorne's smug, triumphant face, it all came rushing back, threatening to break her spirit completely. But Silas was not finished. "There is no front door," he said, a slow, sly smile touching his lips for the first time. "But I always build a back door, a personal fail-safe. Men like Thorne, they pay for loyalty, but they never earn it. I never trusted him. I built a single-use access key, a line of code hidden within the server's boot-up protocol. It's not a password, it's a logic bomb. If you can get physical access to the server room and input this sequence during a system reboot, it will bypass the primary encryption for exactly 60 seconds, giving you just enough time to copy the root directory. After that, the key burns itself out and the door is sealed forever." It was an incredibly dangerous high-stakes gamble. They would have one chance, a 1-minute window, to pull off the digital heist of the century. Physical access was the new impossible challenge. The server wasn't in some remote data center. Silas confirmed it was located in a secure sub-basement room in the Thorne Capital headquarters building in Manhattan, a building with more security than a military base. The plan they formulated on the long drive back to the city was audacious, bordering on insane. They couldn't break in, they had to be let in. Their key was not a lockpick, but human nature itself. Julian's research had uncovered that Thorne, in another act of supreme arrogance, was planning a massive public relations event at his headquarters. He was hosting a gala for a children's hospital, a transparent attempt to launder his predatory reputation with a veneer of philanthropy. The event would mean hundreds of outside staff, caterers, florists, technicians, flooding the building. It was the perfect cover. Ilara, the invisible waitress, would once again use her ability to blend in, to become part of the scenery. She would pose as a member of the catering staff, a role she could play to perfection. Chen provided them with detailed floor plans of the building from his time there, highlighting the location of the server room and the routes of the security patrols. Silas gave Ilara a small, custom-built hard drive containing the logic bomb and a high-speed data transfer program. The stage was set for the most important performance of her life. The night of the gala arrived, a swirl of flashing camera bulbs, expensive perfume, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The Thorn Capitol building was transformed, its cold corporate lobby now a glittering ballroom. Ilara moved through the chaos with a calm, focused grace, her simple black catering uniform a perfect camouflage. Her heart was a steady drum against her ribs, her senses heightened to an almost painful degree. Every detail was etched in her mind: the pattern of the security guards, movements, the location of the cameras, the timing of the speeches. She could feel the weight of the drive in her pocket, a small, cold piece of metal that held the key to her family's salvation and Thorn's damnation. In her ear, a tiny concealed communication device connected her to Julian and Finch, who were parked in a van a block away, monitoring security feeds they had hacked into. It was a symphony of risk, with every player executing their part with perfect, nerve-wracking precision. Following Chen's directions, she found her way to the service corridors, the unglamorous underbelly of the building. The air grew colder as she descended into the sub-basement levels. The sound of the party above faded, replaced by the low hum of the building's machinery. She found the server room, an unmarked metal door with a sophisticated electronic keypad. As planned, Julian triggered a minor, temporary electrical surge in another part of the building, a momentary distraction that drew the lone security guard away from his post. Ilara's fingers flew over the keypad, entering a temporary service code Chen had given her, a code that was only active during large-scale events. The lock clicked open. She slipped inside, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft, definitive thud. She was in. She stood in the cold, humming heart of Marcus Thorne's empire, a room filled with blinking lights and the quiet whir of cooling fans. It was a digital mausoleum, a tomb where the ghosts of his crimes were laid to rest, and she was there to resurrect them. She located the main server rack, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Following Silas's instructions, she initiated the reboot sequence. A countdown timer appeared on a small monitor, 120 seconds until full system restart. Her own countdown had begun. Her breath hitched in her throat, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. The screen went dark as the system powered down. Now, she plugged in the drive. A simple command line appeared. Her fingers, steady and sure, typed in the long, complex string of code Silas had made her memorize, the backdoor key. She hit enter. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The screen remained blank. She felt a surge of pure, sickening panic. Had it failed? Had they come all this way for nothing? Then, a new window flickered to life. Root directory access granted. 60 seconds remaining. It was working. A wave of adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through her. She initiated the transfer program. A progress bar appeared, its green light crawling across the screen with agonizing slowness. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. 45 seconds. 30 seconds. The progress bar was only halfway there. The sheer volume of data, a decade of secrets, was too much. It wasn't going to finish in time. Ilara's mind raced, searching for a solution, a shortcut. She scanned the directory list that had populated on the screen. She couldn't take everything. She had to choose. Her eyes found it instantly. A folder labeled with her father's company name, Vance_Inov_ACQ. She canceled the full transfer and targeted only that folder. The The new progress bar shot across the screen. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. Transfer complete. She ripped the drive from the port just as the main screen flickered back to life, the standard Thorn Capital logo appearing as the system rebooted. 5 seconds. She was out the door, pulling it shut behind her, the lock clicking back into place just as she heard the footsteps of the returning security guard. She flattened herself into a darkened alcove, her body trembling, her lungs burning, clutching the small drive in her hand. It was done. She had the proof. She had the weapon. The checkmate was now in her hand. The conference hall was a monument to modern hubris, a cathedral of glass and steel built to deify the very concept of ethical capitalism. Marcus Thorne stood at its center, bathed in the warm, forgiving glow of a dozen spotlights, a benevolent king addressing his loyal subjects. The air was thick with the scent of catered canapés and expensive cologne, a sterile, corporate version of the opulence he commanded at the Aegis Club. He spoke in smooth, practiced platitudes, his voice a rich baritone that resonated with false sincerity, weaving a narrative of compassionate commerce and social responsibility that was as beautifully constructed and hollow as the room itself. To the rapt audience of CEOs, journalists, and aspiring tycoons, he was the paradigm of success, a man who had mastered the universe of finance and now sought to gift them his wisdom. He had long since dismissed the incident at the restaurant as the hysterical outburst of a deranged employee, a minor inconvenience that had been swiftly and efficiently excised from his life. He felt untouchable, his power absolute, his narrative unassailable. He did not see the quiet woman sitting in the 12th row, a ghost from a past he had chosen to forget, her simple gray business suit a stark contrast to the sea of bespoke tailoring surrounding her. He did not see Ilara Vance, and in that blindness, his doom was already sealed. Within her, there was no storm, no churning sea of anxiety. There was only a profound and terrifying calm, the stillness of a frozen lake beneath which a powerful current moved. The small, unassuming hard drive in her jacket pocket felt as heavy and significant as a crown jewel, a dense repository of truth ready to shatter this kingdom of lies. Her heart did not race. It beat with a slow, steady, and deliberate rhythm, a metronome marking the final, measured beats of his reign. The master of ceremonies announced the beginning of the question and answer session, and a line began to form at the microphone positioned in the center aisle. The first few questions were softballs, lobbed by friendly journalists and fawning academics, each one designed to further burnish Thorne's carefully crafted image. He answered them with practiced ease, his charm and confidence radiating from the stage. Then, Ilara rose from her seat. She did not hurry. Her movements were fluid and deliberate as she walked to the end of the line, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed not on Thorne, but on the microphone, the instrument of her impending declaration. One by one, the people ahead of her asked their questions, and she waited, a portrait of patience and resolve. When her turn finally came, she stepped onto the small platform, her sensible shoes making no sound on the plush carpeting. She adjusted the microphone, the small movement seeming to draw the attention of the entire room. It was then that Thorne truly saw her. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the irritation of a king being addressed by a commoner. Then, as his eyes focused, a wave of recognition washed over him, followed by a shadow of confusion and a dawning, sickening dread. He remembered the waitress, the insolent girl from the restaurant. But the woman standing before him now was not her. This woman held no tray, wore no uniform, and her eyes held not a trace of deference, only the cold, clear light of judgment. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the cavernous hall, each word perfectly enunciated, a marvel of clarity and control. "Mr. Thorne," she began, "my name is Ilara Vance. I have a simple question for you. Could you please tell this audience about your very first acquisition, the one that you yourself have called the masterpiece upon which your empire was built? Could you tell us about Vance Innovations?" Thorne froze. his hand, which had been gesturing magnanimously, stopping midair. The name, her father's name, hung in the air like a death sentence. The carefully constructed facade of the benevolent titan cracked, and for a fleeting second, the raw, cornered predator beneath was visible to all. He opened his mouth to respond, to deflect, to summon his army of public relations-approved denials, but no words came. It was in that precise moment of stunned silence that Julian and Finch, from their command center in the van, launched their attack. The massive state-of-the-art LED screens behind the stage, which had been displaying the conference logo and Thorne's beatific face, suddenly went dark. A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. Then, they flickered back to life, not with the conference branding, but with a single, damning image. On one side of the screen was a high-resolution scan of Arthur Vance's genuine signature, taken from an old employment contract. On the other was the forgery from the acquisition agreement, the one Thorne had so proudly displayed. Lines and callouts, the work of a world-renowned forensic document examiner, highlighted every inconsistency. The unnatural pen lifts, the hesitant strokes, the telltale signs of a clumsy tracing. The forgery was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of scientific fact, displayed 40 feet high for the entire world to see. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a heavy, suffocating blanket of shared shock. Ilara stood motionless at the microphone, her work done, allowing the irrefutable digital evidence to become the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. The screens began to cycle through a cascade of evidence, a digital avalanche that buried Thorne alive. The backdated patent transfer clause appeared, highlighted in crimson, with a timeline next to it showing the date of the USPTO filing that proved its fraudulent nature. Next came excerpts from the internal emails, retrieved from the Ghost server, in which a young David Chen desperately questioned the legality of the strategy, only to be overruled by Thorne himself, whose own words, arrogant and dismissive, damned him utterly. A sworn, videotaped affidavit from Chen played without sound, his haunted face a silent testament to the crime he had been forced to participate in. Financial charts filled the screen, showing the true explosive valuation of the patents that Thorne had acquired for pennies on the dollar. The entire sordid story was laid bare, not with accusations, but with cold, hard, and incontrovertible proof. Thorne stood on the stage, a statue of crumbling stone. The color drained from his face, leaving a waxy gray pallor. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He gripped the sides of the sleek, modern lectern, his knuckles white, as if it were the only thing holding him upright, the only thing keeping him from collapsing into the rubble of his own life. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters, smelling the biggest corporate scandal of the decade, scrambled from their seats, shouting questions, their camera flashes firing like a barrage of artillery. His board members, his allies, the very people who had applauded him moments before, now stared at him with expressions of horror and betrayal, already calculating the damage to their own reputations, their own fortunes. They began to stand up and walk away, a silent mass exodus that left him utterly alone in the glare of the spotlights. Through the cacophony, Ilara's voice rose one final time, clear and unwavering, a final, devastating epitaph for his reign. "Justice for my father," she said, her voice ringing with the weight of a decade of pain and love, "and for everyone you stepped on to get here." Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when the evidence appeared on those screens. The downfall was not a slow decline, it was a spectacular, instantaneous implosion. The live-streamed exposé went viral before Thorne even had a chance to flee the stage. By the time he was bundled into the back of his limousine by his shell-shocked security team, the stock of Thorne Capital was in freefall, plummeting in after-hours trading as a tidal wave of panic selling wiped out billions of dollars in market capitalization in a matter of minutes. The Securities and Exchange Commission, armed with the mountain of evidence Julian had delivered to their doorstep that very morning, announced an immediate, full-scale investigation and froze all of Thorne's personal and corporate assets. The story was the lead item on every news network, his face plastered across every screen, no longer as a titan of industry, but as a common corporate criminal. The men and women who had once vied for his attention, who had considered a moment of his time to be a priceless commodity, now instructed their assistants to block his calls and delete his contact information. He was no longer a king. He was a leper, a pariah whose touch was toxic. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, had been demolished by a single, perfectly aimed stone of truth, and he was left buried in the ruins, stripped of his wealth, his power, his reputation, and the only identity he had ever known. The legal battle was short and brutal. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the testimony of David Chen, who had been granted immunity, Thorne was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, insider trading, and racketeering. His trial was a public spectacle that ended in a guilty verdict, and the man who once ruled the world from a penthouse office was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison, a final, ignominious end to his reign of terror. Several months later, long after the dust had settled and the name Marcus Thorne had become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, Ilara received a phone call. It was from the CEO of a rival technology firm, a respected, innovative company run by a woman who had always admired Arthur Vance's genius from afar. She explained that her company had successfully acquired the original Vance Innovations patents from the bankruptcy proceedings, finally freeing them from the tainted legacy of Thorne Capital. She told Ilara that they did not just want to use the patents, they wanted to honor the man who created them. She offered Ilara a position, not just a job, but a mission. She asked her to lead a new, independent division within the company, an incubator and legal shield for small, brilliant innovators who lacked the resources to protect themselves from predators like Thorne. The division was to be named the Arthur Vance Institute for Ethical Innovation. Ilara accepted without hesitation. The first day she walked into her new office, a bright, sunlit space with views of the entire city, she felt the last of the heavy, cold weight she had carried for a decade finally lift from her shoulders. That evening, she visited her father. She sat by his chair, holding his hand, and told him everything. She told him his name was on a building again, that his work was finally in the hands of people who would use it for good, and that his legacy was no longer one of tragedy, but one of inspiration and justice. He could not speak, but he turned his head and looked at her, and in his eyes, for the first time in years, she saw a clear, unmistakable flicker of the brilliant, proud man he had once been. A single tear rolled down his cheek, and in that shared, silent moment, she knew he understood. Ilara's journey had not been one of revenge, for revenge is a fire that consumes everything, leaving only ash. Hers had been a quest for justice, a meticulous, determined effort to rebuild what had been broken, to restore what had been stolen. She had not sought to destroy a man, but to dismantle a lie, and in doing so, she had found a purpose far greater than she had ever imagined. She became a guardian at the gate, using her formidable legal mind not to amass a personal fortune, but to build a fortress for the creative, the brilliant, and the vulnerable. Her story became a quiet legend in the corridors of power, a powerful reminder that integrity is a weapon that the arrogant can never truly defend against, and that courage can be found in the most unexpected of places. She never forgot the feel of the waitress's uniform, the weight of the serving tray, or the sting of casual dismissal. Those memories were not scars, they were her armor, a constant reminder of the world she fought for, a world where a person's worth was measured not by the size of their bank account, but by the content of their character and the light of their ideas. She had descended into the heart of darkness not to fight a monster, but to rescue her father's name, and in the process, she had found her own, becoming a beacon of hope for all the other innovators who dared to dream of changing the world. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.